everyone. Coming to you today to present over Mastering Minds, Practical Strategies for Emotional Regulation and Executive Function. Quick, just little notice. We recorded this in two separate parts. It'll be a full video today, but you'll see a little bit of a difference. I'll be wearing different clothes. So without further ado, to jump right in. Today, we're going to be going over a comprehensive clinical overview of emotional regulation, what it is, how it develops, when it breaks down, and what we can do about it. And I'm very, very excited to be joined by Dr. DeSantis from Ridge Psychological. Dr. DeSantis is a New York State licensed psychologist and the owner of Ridge Psychological in Park Slope, Brooklyn. She brings many years of experience from both hospital and private practice settings, and her group practice provides individual, group, and parent therapy, as well as neuropsychological assessments for children, adolescents, and adults. And I am Casey Schmaliger from New Frontiers Executive Function Coaching. I'm the vice president. We do executive function coaching through the lifespan, typically starting around 10 years old, all the way through adulthood. So today, what we're going to be talking about is really moving from some core executive function concepts to help show where emotional regulation fits into the executive function framework. We'll move a little bit into what is emotional regulation. And at that point, I will be passing it over to Dr. DeSantis to go through critical factors in development, what dysregulation looks like, associated conditions, parent and child techniques, and which therapies can help. So emotional regulation is often misunderstood. So before we dive into strategies, it's important to reframe how we think about emotional regulation because it's frequently mischaracterized. It is often treated as a personality trait, something you're just born with or without, or its own standalone mental health issue, something a person has or doesn't have. But the reality that we're looking at is that emotional regulation is not a standalone skill. It is part of this larger self-regulation and executive function system, which can be understood, taught, and strengthened at any age. There's a growth mindset aspect to emotional regulation that we can learn from our previous experiences and then grow. So what is self-regulation, or this concept of executive functions? And when we're looking right now at self-regulation, we're going to look at one piece of executive functions. So self-regulation is the overarching capacity that governs how we manage ourselves in the pursuit of goals. It's the foundation upon which emotional regulation rests. And so there are these aspects of controlling our impulses, pausing before acting on the first instinct. There is directing our attention, so sustaining focus on what matters most to us and our goals. Managing our emotions, so modulating emotional responses to fit the situation for our actual strategic aims instead of just reacting. Or persisting towards goals, staying on track despite obstacles or discomfort. And so the key principle here is self-regulation is the ability for us to manage ourselves to act in alignment with our goals rather than immediate impulses. Everything else in this presentation does flow from this definition, and it's really important for us to be able to look at how emotional regulation can sometimes get in the way of us achieving our goals and moving away from more of an animalistic way of thinking, more towards this very rational human way of thinking. So starting with this executive function framework, one of the key core executive functions is inhibitory control, which is the brain's brake system. And at the heart of this is the brain's ability to pause, suppress, or override our automatic instinctual responses. And this is where we're really creating a critical gap between a stimulus coming in and a response. And so that space in between the stimulus and a response is the opportunity for us to be strategic and to choose how we act. And I always like to say, like, hindsight's 2020. And what inhibitory control is trying to do is to build that space where it doesn't need to be that, oh, I wish I did this last time. More, we're trying to build out space so that I wish I did this, we actually have time to think about that in the moment. So some aspects of this, it might look like not interrupting. So when we're able to hold back a thought or comment until the right moment, that's inhibitory control. When we're able to ignore distractions, filtering out irrelevant stimuli to stay on task, that's inhibitory control. When we're able to pause before reacting, creating that space. And in this particular example of emotional regulation, creating the space between an emotional trigger and a behavioral response, that's inhibitory control. So every strategy and technique in this presentation is building from this inhibitory control. So there are three ways that we are using inhibitory control to regulate ourselves. So they are distinct, but they are interconnected. And so together, these help us stay aligned with our intention rather than our impulses. The first is response inhibition, where we're stopping actions. This is where it might look like we're blurting out answers when we don't have response inhibition, interrupting others, acting before thinking. Then we also have cognitive inhibition, managing thoughts, ignoring distractions, staying on task, and filtering out irrelevant information. This is really where we're inhibiting our thinking processes, managing those thoughts. And the final category is this interference control, where we're managing competing signals. And so it might look like frustration, anxiety, or strong urges or cravings. And so while all these systems are constantly working together to keep us aligned with what we're trying to do, um, they have, even when internal or external forces are pushing back against this is how they're staying aligned and keeping us moving forward. So let's zone in a little bit more on this interference control, the competing signals in the brain. So when our goal-directed thinking breaks down, it's usually because one or more types of interference has taken over. And understanding, breaking down this interference even more is the first step towards addressing what is getting in the way. So the first two are cognitive interference and motivational interference. So with cognitive interference, this is often when we have too many thoughts at once, we're losing track of steps or sequences, and mental overload or cognitive fatigue sets in. With motivational interference, this is when we're wanting to do something easier or more fun, avoiding effort or challenge, or choosing some short-term reward over long-term goals. But the one we're really going to be focusing on and zoning in on today is emotional interference. This is when we have things like frustration derailing our focus, anxiety narrowing our attention, or angering, overwhelming executive control. Dr. DeSantis is going to go a little bit more into this aspect of it's when our emotional brain is dictating things instead of our rational brain. And a key insight here is that all three types of interference can pull us away from goal-directed thinking, but each does require a different response strategy. And so looking at this larger framework, where does emotional regulation fit in? We have the self-regulation on this upper level, self-regulation and executive functions. Then we have inhibitory controls. What are the core executive functions? Then we have interference control, one aspect of inhibitory controls. And then within that, we have emotional regulation. And so emotional regulation is what inhibitory control looks like when emotions are a competing signal. I know I should do this, but I feel this. And so where I'm starting off and presenting over is really looking at one of the two lenses that are looking at the same system. So both perspectives are really important. Both perspectives can be necessary, can support in developing emotional regulation systems and strategies to help us better regulate our emotions, but they are distinct. And so in the executive function coaching lens, looks like things like building pause and response systems, managing attention and behavior, structuring our environments for success, developing routines and scaffolding. So this is a very coaching lens to work on and tackle emotional dysregulation. But there is this therapeutic lens as well. And understanding emotional triggers, processing emotional experiences, building emotional awareness and vocabulary, or developing adaptive coping responses, these all fall under this therapeutic lens. And so we've been looking at how the brain regulates competing signals, but now we're going to zoom in on these emotions and this therapeutic lens themselves. And where do they come from and how we work with them effectively? And this is where I'm going to pass it over to Dr. DeSantis, because it really is important to understand that emotional regulation does not have one fix. And bringing in different perspectives and approaches can help individuals figure out the best strategy for them to move forward, to mitigate the challenges, and really lean into our strengths. So, without further ado, passing it over to Dr. DeSantis.
Thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate it. So I want to start tonight by just thanking everyone for being here. I know this is an incredibly busy time for everybody, so thank you for your time and attention. I thought of starting to talk about emotion regulation by talking about one of my favorite childhood characters, which is Cookie Monster, as a great example of the challenges we all have with managing our strong emotions and impulses. All of us remember how enthusiastic Cookie Monster was and is, but his impulsive pursuit of cookies, and right as a way of illustrating difficulty with emotion regulation. So I think he's a perfect character to help us highlight how to learn to delay gratification, calm our excitement as an important tool for children and adults to be working on. And this is a great, if you get a chance to check out the NPR segment on emotion regulation and Cookie Monster. It's a fun watch. So let me speak a little bit more. I know Casey did a great job talking about what emotion regulation is. I want to split it up a little bit more into kind of three types of areas that I think are incredibly important and that I'll be focusing on tonight, right? So emotion regulation, if we think about intrinsic regulation, that's how we manage our own emotional states. It's recognizing a feeling, it's labeling those feelings, and then selecting an appropriate response strategy, right? Then there's extrinsic regulation, which is for all of you parents, caretakers, teachers, and the like out there. It's the co-regulation provided by you all that's especially critical for children whose self-regulation systems are still developing. And we will talk about some of those strategies tonight. And then I also want to highlight that there are adaptive regulation strategies as well as less adaptive or more maladaptive regulation strategies. So regulation strategies like deep breathing, which we will be working on together tonight, or less healthy strategies like avoidance, suppression, even substance use, right? And the goal when I'm working with a family, and I hope you'll take this into your work as well, is how to expand that adaptive toolkit for any child or adult. Right? So I'm going to invite us all to start with a guided breathing practice, right? There'll only be a couple of exercises tonight, I promise, but I thought as I'm teaching you these techniques, I actually want you to practice them with me. And in doing so, are more likely to feel comfortable than teaching your child, student, or anyone that you are working with on how to utilize it. So people often teach deep breathing, works for some, not all, but I thought it was a good starting point. So what I'd like you to do to start is just notice sensations in your body right now and where your current mood is at, right? And right, just noticing that to start. And what I'm now going to do is just take you through 2 rounds of using your breath, right? So I'll have you inhale for 4 seconds. I'll have you hold it for 2 seconds and then exhale for 6 seconds. And like I said, we'll cycle through that twice, right? So let's start with that inhale. So I'm going to have you count. I'm going to have you breathe in to a count of 4. So let's breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it for 2. Right? And now exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do that one more time. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it 1, 2. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right? And I'd love you to just sit for a moment and just reflect on what might have changed just in those 2 simple rounds of doing those breathing exercises together. Notice do your hands feel any lighter? Arms feel any lighter? Legs feel any less tight? Face even feeling less constricted? Or anything that changed in terms of your emotional states? As I said before, this doesn't work for everybody, but it's a good place to get started as we're trying to teach some of these strategies to kids and adults. Right? And if you did want to reflect anything in the chat, please feel free to. Right? So I'll move on to talking a bit about some critical factors in self-regulation development. Right? So a child's capacity to regulate their emotions is shaped by 2 main things, by their biological predispositions and also their environmental experience. And there's an interaction, of course, between those 2 things. So for any of you who are parents to multiple children, you probably noticed, right, that every child is born with their innate temperament. Right, in this regard. Some babies are naturally better able to self-soothe and regulate than others, right? And these differences are measurable from birth and influence the trajectory of their regulation development, right? And their early environment is incredibly important in addition to that. So quality of caregiving, the stability in the family, exposure to stress and trauma all shape that regulatory system, particularly in the first few years of life. There is a sensitive period, particularly before the age of 2, that is incredibly important for the development of emotion regulation. And so early co-regulation, there's that word again, and we'll get back to it, lay that neural groundwork. But it's not absolute. And I want to be very clear on that, right? These are skills, as Casey said, that can be learned, right? Throughout childhood, throughout adolescence, and well into adulthood. Right? And why is emotion regulation so important, right? Of course, there are many reasons why in the moment we want children to work on their emotion regulation skills as we do with adults. But there are a lot of long-term impacts of emotion regulation as well that I think are just important to highlight. What the research says, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I just highlighted a couple of things here, that children who regulate well from early on more likely have stronger relationships. That means more secure and positive bonds with peers, caregivers, and teachers. These kids also tend to do better academically. They can manage their feelings in a more better way and engage more effectively with learning. And they're also more resilient to adversity throughout their lives, so they could better handle and bounce back from difficult or adverse events that they might encounter throughout their lives. Right? And so again, as I mentioned a moment ago, when children's skills are underdeveloped, we do find that this has a ripple effect throughout the child's environment and throughout their lives. So the immediate impact are things like behavioral outbursts or tantrums, for example, a more strained relationship between parents and children, a more disrupted household, and some social difficulties come along with that. And then on the longer term side, we do see that these kids who have more persistent emotion dysregulation issues are more at risk for certain things like anxiety, eating disorders, depression, and other forms of psychopathology. Right? And I know Casey did a beautiful job on talking about how our brain works, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that I like to teach the families I work with. If you imagine your brain as a fist, right, and you could do all this in the privacy of your home as well, if we think about, right, our emotion brain, right, that lies here in our palm. That's our amygdala. You've probably heard that term before. It's our fight, flight, or freeze responses come from this area of our brain, right? Then we've got our prefrontal cortex. That's our control center for our brain. It's where we plan, make decisions, right? And that's maturing well into our 20s, right? When we work on building emotion regulation strategies, we are actually increasing the connection between that amygdala and that prefrontal cortex, right? Using that cingulate cortex, which is mentioned there, right? I like to think about it as, here's our emotion brain, here's our thinking brain, right? The more we build in emotion regulation strategies, the stronger the connection is between that emotion brain and our thinking brain. On the other side of it, the less connected those areas are, the harder it is for children to regulate, right? And I'll be referring back to that a bit as we're chatting today. All right, so let's think about signs of emotion dysregulation. So there are a range of observable behaviors that help us recognize these signs of dysregulation early so that we can then provide effective intervention. So some kids and adults who are inclined to get dysregulated have very overly intense emotions, and particularly overly intense emotions that are disproportionate to the triggering event or the situation in front of them. Right? These again might be individuals who are more likely to act without thinking, right? And they have difficulty pausing before they respond. They have less emotional awareness and actually have difficulty identifying or naming their emotions. We'll go into that in a moment. They have trouble making decisions, so they get flooded by their emotions, and again, it impairs judgment and problem solving. Or they might be individuals who actually shut down or avoid emotions, and so they will do withdrawal, shut down, escape behaviors when they're emotionally challenged. Right? And on the more significant side of things, when individuals have emotion dysregulation, we'll see they're more inclined, like I said earlier, for disordered eating to help them cope, self-injurious behavior like cutting to manage emotional pain, suicidal thoughts or actions because of the amount of distress they're under, or alcohol or drug use to suppress or escape, right, from difficult emotions. Right? And emotion regulation itself is not a diagnosis, but it is a core feature of many clinical diagnoses out there that are listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a sense that it is a core component in many diagnoses that individuals might be dealing with. And recognizing this overlap can help clinicians identify what they need to work on in treatment planning, and can help improve clinical outcomes across all of these conditions. Right? So I did say I was going to bother you every once in a while with some exercises, and I've got another one here that I'd like you to try. I'm going to do the parent version or adult version of this exercise first, and then give you a sense of maybe how to introduce it to a child in a much more playful way. Right? This is called a grounding exercise. It helps anchor you in the present moment. right? So it can be used for a number of different feelings that you might be feeling at any particular time, right? But it really forces you to engage your senses, which again gets you out of emotion brain and more challenged into thinking brain, right? So again, take a moment to sit comfortably in your chair. You can look at me or look at any place on the screen, right? And I'd like you to first start by just naming 5 things around that you can see around you. You can do that silently, or you can log that into the chat if you'd like to. I'd like you to then identify 4 things you can physically feel. Again, your arms, your legs, your face, your head, any of those things that you're feeling right now. Notice 3 things that you can hear. Right? Then notice 2 things you can smell. And 1 thing that you can taste, even if it's a subtle taste that you can discern. Right? I'm just pausing to give you all a chance to work on that for a moment. Right, now if we're exposing our kids to this, I'm imagining a scenario, I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this talk, where my kids were getting dysregulated in the back seat of the car. And I tried to introduce some of these kind of grounding exercises in a playful way, right? So thinking about, okay, kids, as quick as you can. What's 5 things you see outside of the car window? Go, right? Tell me 4 things you feel right now. Go, right? 3 things you hear, and so on and so forth, right? So it feels much more of like a game kind of activity than it does another boring activity that someone's trying to get them to do, right? All right, so we've talked a bit about emotion regulation, and now I want to take you through some of the steps on how do we develop emotion regulation skills in kids and adults, right? So one of the basic things I want to start with any family I'm working with is really emotion identification education. So teaching kids, and again, I keep adding adults in here as well, to name how they feel. And in a few moments, I'm going to show you a slide dedicated to that. Really important, identifying what skills and strengths or coping habits a child already has, right? So that we're not starting from zero. I know that all children have some coping strategies that we're already using. Some may be more adaptive, some less, but I want to highlight those as part of the work. And then invite them to experiment with trying different strategies with me. I'm calling it an experiment on purpose, right? Kids understand who scientists are. They often don't understand, right, who therapists are, for example, like me, but they do know who scientists are and they often think they're cool. And if I can engage them around doing experiments just like scientists do, I'm more likely to get some buy-in, right? And scientists do experiments, but don't necessarily know which ones will work and which ones don't. So it's about trying it and then figuring out which ones work. And over time, the next piece of this slide, right, is building a toolkit. Compiling a list of strategies that work across different contexts or might be context specific, but that your child and you are aware of. Right? That then gives you the tools to plan ahead for triggers that might be coming, events or vacations, so that you can use those strategies and think proactively with your child before the storm hits or before a dysregulated episode happens. So let's start with emotion identification. Right? This is a very simple, a flyer that I found online. You can Google it. I like this one a lot because it's not very word heavy. It's face heavy. And so even quite young kids can use it. And then, of course, I've got an older version for kids who are a bit older. right? But first and foremost is really helping kids and adults name how they feel, right? What research tells us is if we can get kids to label their emotions, it reduces the intensity of their emotional experience, and it activates, again, that prefrontal cortex, right? Takes us out of emotion brain, brings us into thinking brain. And I do recommend and often print out these kinds of charts for families to take home and have in front of them, right? Have it on their fridge, have it in their child's room, have it anywhere you feel like might be helpful so that you can refer to it, right? And I always say we don't want to practice dysregulation skills when their kids are in a crisis, right? So we don't want to name our emotions when kids are really activated. We want to practice pretty regularly when they're calm, and then build that vocabulary for when they need it, when they are dysregulated, and help them expand their vocabulary from just happy, sad, and angry to maybe include more complex emotions like frustrated, overwhelmed, nervous, embarrassed, and the like. Right? So, as we said before, again, we're working on building this emotion regulation toolkit. So I'm going to give you a list of some ideas here. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a starting point. It's a place to start. So an effective toolkit I can recommend often has multiple skills as a path to regulation. So some sensory related skills, some physical ones, creative ones, more relational ones, right? And the goal is to match that skill to the state that the child's in, but also their preferences, right? So visual calming skills. For any of you who've seen sand timers or liquid timers, those are really great because they focus the child, right, on what's visually in front of them, and they could practice breathing while they're using it. Comfort items like their favorite toys, hugs from their parents or significant others, or special others, I should say. Soft textures. I use a lot of, I don't know if any of you have seen that kind of, almost looks like a Band-Aid, but it's very bumpy. And so I give those out often to kids who have a phone or a notebook or a school bag to put it on, and they could rub it, and they really enjoy that rough texture. A physical release can be an incredible way to work on emotion regulation. So jumping rope, trampolines, even pushing against a wall, any physical way of discharging their feelings. Unwinding activities like blowing bubbles, blowing up a balloon, coloring in a coloring book, reading a book, listening to music, right? Distraction techniques or redirecting their attention to things like painting, working with their hands with clay, whistling, right? Shifting focus away from that emotional trigger, again, to a cognitive focus. And then sensory tools or oral sensory tools, chewing gum, chewing on an apple or a snack. Again, that oral input can get kids into a new or different emotional state. Right? And what I'm going to show you next is some toolkits that I created with different kids that I've worked with in the past. This child picked a tree as where they wanted to draw or write all of the coping strategies we worked on together. And I actually had them draw a tree or pulled one offline, and we just labeled all over the tree all the different strategies that they found were helpful to work on, that we worked on together. Some of them we've just mentioned in our talk so far. That breathing technique that we practiced at the outset, again, works for some kids, not for all. For some, it actually makes them more anxious, and that's one I'm going to scratch off the list right away if it does that. Music, as I mentioned before, that 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique that we practiced a moment ago. Things like a weighted blanket, right? Or something other tight kind of way that you could wrap a child, kind of like a burrito, that would make them feel secure. And for some kids, it's even putting some cold water on their face, chewing on ice, putting ice in their hands or on the back of their neck as a way to really lower how they're, how stimulated they are, right, in that moment. I'll show you a different one. This is a coping campfire. A child who was going away to camp and really wanted some strategies to help them manage their emotions while they were away. And so we came up with a couple of strategies. This is not all of them, but just a few that I'll talk about that are on here. But positive self-talk. We will actually do an exercise in a few minutes on how to practice this, but how to replace self-critical thinking or catastrophic dialogue that goes on in kids or adults' heads with more accurate, realistic, compassionate statements, right? Using techniques like walking, right? Hanging out with friends, that social connection can be incredibly powerful to help them co-regulate. Sleep as a tool. Sometimes sleep could be a way to get over a dysregulated episode if none of these other techniques work. But also having adequate sleep could be a way to help kids stay more regulated, in the short and long term. Right? So speaking of in the moment versus long-term tools, right? So understanding the distinction between acute coping strategies and more long-term habits is critical, right? Both are actually quite necessary, but they do serve different functions. So the in-the-moment tools that I've been talking about so far, like the breathing exercises, the grounding techniques, right? This is used when dysregulation is happening, right? But then there's long-term strategies which have a cumulative benefit over time. So consistent habits like adequate and regular sleep, which I know is hard for all of us to get as adults, as well as for kids to get these days. Any kind of daily physical expenditure of energy. I'm remiss to say exercise because that doesn't work for everyone, but any way that kids or adults can expend some physical energy, consistent routines and structure, right? If kids need a higher level of support or parents need a higher level of support, therapy and other professional support. And then things like maintaining healthy relationships and healthy boundaries in those relationships. Right? I think the key message here that I want to highlight is that regulation doesn't get built in times of crisis. It's built through small habits that you practice over time. And in the moment tools work best when they've been practiced in advance and when those long-term foundational tools that I just mentioned are also in place as well. Right? So talking more about that personal toolkit, again, regulation and the strategies that help someone get regulated are deeply personal. What calms one person, as I've said a moment ago, may not work for others. But it's why building an individualized toolkit through trial and error and reflection is absolutely essential. And as you saw a moment ago, I actually draw these things out with kids or grab a picture offline, and I want that posted at home, and I would encourage you all to do the same. So identifying what works for you or your child is number one important. Using a trial and error approach, as I mentioned, and expecting that certain things are not going to work. In fact, what I say to kids is, let's come up with different strategies and try them. And as quick as we can cross things off the list, we're going to get to the ones that work and that we want to add to our permanent list. So let's try as many as we can, right? Without judgment, but more curiosity, right? And that's going to give us valuable information, right? Keeping a log of what activates stress responses, right? Patterns will emerge over time. You may be very well aware of what gets you dysregulated or gets your child dysregulated, right? And enabling proactive rather than reactive management of those reactions, right? And tracking, like I said, what helps, right? Having it written down so that you could return to it in that dysregulated state and know what to do. And then different settings will be a call for different tools. So a strategy that works at home may not be appropriate at school or at work or in a social setting. So having some flexibility built into your toolkit over time, super helpful to really meet your child's needs or your needs no matter what situation they're faced with. Right. So I did tell you that I was going to come back and do another exercise. This one is referring back to that positive self-talk that I mentioned to you earlier. Right. And it invites you to observe your inner dialogue, right? And hopefully cultivate over time a more compassionate way of speaking to yourself and approaching mistakes or maybe mishaps that have happened. So I'm going to invite you all, right, just to take a moment to think about a recent mistake you made, a challenging interaction you had, or just a stressful moment, right? And just try to briefly remember that situation in your mind, right? And then if you can, think about or write about any words that you said to yourself, thoughts that you said to yourself, or feelings that you said to yours, or feelings that you noted that you directed towards yourself in that moment. And try to be honest here, right? I know that there are moments where we might be saying, we're just a awful parent or an awful psychologist or, right, an awful employee, right? Now I want you to switch the scenario. I want you to imagine a close friend telling you they made the same mistake or faced the same challenge. What comforting, supportive, or understanding words would you offer them? Right? And observe the difference between what you say to yourself, right, versus what you might say to a friend. Right? And then the fifth piece, which is not here, but I'm just going to slip it in, is over time working on replacing some of those self-critical thoughts with more realistic thoughts. Notice I didn't say positive thoughts or, exaggerated thoughts, right? I'm the best parent in the world. I'm the most wonderful psychologist in the world. Not that. But rather, right, I made a mistake today, right? Today was maybe my not best parenting day, or this afternoon was not my best parenting moment. But I'm going to do this differently tonight or tomorrow to see if I can shift things for next time. Right? All right. So I think parents are an important part in regulation. So I want to focus on some strategies for promoting emotion regulation in parents as well as in kids by extension. Right? So starting early. Begin emotional coaching from when kids are young, as early as infancy, right? And it's okay for you as parents or providers to name emotions out loud that you might be experiencing, right? And narrate to your child or that person in the room what you're doing to regulate yourself, right? So I got really upset and I need a few moments to do some deep breathing right now, and then I'm going to come back, right? Kids are watching, right? So they will learn a lot from your modeling, right? Work as a team. So Ensure that you're working with your child and that you're matching their developmental stage with your expectations of them, right? Praising when they are doing something well with a regulation, right? So that they're more likely to continue doing that, right? Staying calm yourself and planning ahead for moments that might be dysregulated moments for your child. So helping yourself calm down will put you in a better position to then help your child. And taking the long-term view. Regulation does take time to build over years and will continue to build and grow well into adulthood. Right? Some day-to-day strategies for you to be thinking about as a parent, right? Developing predictable routines that help reduce your anxiety and build your self-regulation skills. Using things like a visual map, like what's up on the screen, right? Or emotion charts to clarify expectations and get everyone in the family prepared for transitions. Using movement breaks for yourself. So regular physical activity, of course, is super helpful. Meeting your sensory needs with calming techniques or stimulating tools that could help you. Making sure you have those social supports. It truly does take a village, right? Or, to work with kids and to work with families. And something I always like to put in there is making sure that all members of the family, there's more equitable distribution of labor within the family, so that there's not too much strain on one particular parent or caregiver versus another, right? And then as we talk about co-regulation, which is, I know, a term I've used a couple of times during the talk, is where it's a process where a child learns to manage their emotions and behaviors through those interactions with those regulated adults, caregivers, teachers, and the like, right? And these are really essential strategies to help kids navigate those strong emotions without feeling that level of shame, right? So trying not to punish the meltdowns. So meltdowns are not intentional, they're not manipulative, they are a sign of overwhelm and that a child's in distress, right? And that they can't access that logical thinking or that thinking brain that I've mentioned a couple of times when they're in that emotional state. So focusing on connecting with them rather than correcting their behavior in that moment. So getting on their level, and I mean that, metaphorically, but also sometimes physically. If it works for your child, getting on their level and meeting them eye to eye, right? Or verbally naming what's happening for them if they can't do so, right? You're feeling really frustrated right now because I didn't allow you to do something that you wanted to do. Providing soothing sensory input if they're okay with that, like a hug or a calm touch. Modeling techniques like deep breathing, a calm tone of voice, right? So that you could help them regulate over time. And some kids, on the other hand, need space. A cozy corner to be in, a quiet space, right? A pillow they could squeeze or punch if that's helpful. So giving them necessary space if they need it. Right? And so I'll turn to the final portion, which is really if you feel like your child or your family needs more support. I'm just going to highlight two different modalities. There are many therapeutic modalities out there. Of course, I'm going to highlight two. One of them is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Many of you might be familiar with this already. It really focuses on the present approach to address thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So identifying unwanted symptoms or behaviors, helping kids connect their thoughts with their emotions, helping them connect their emotions and their behaviors, and over time, replacing unhelpful thoughts and behaviors with more productive ones, right? That can then help them improve their regulation skills over time. I will mention another approach, which is called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, and that was developed specifically for individuals who have significant emotion dysregulation issues, and now has been, utilized with many different populations, including children and teens. And it really talks about acceptance, but also change through 5 kind of core skills or domains. One of them is building mindfulness. So, awareness of the present moment is kind of a foundational skill of DBT. Working on emotion dysregulation or working on emotion regulation skills. Working on interpersonal effectiveness, how to maintain relationships, set limits, and the like. Building up distress tolerance. And then walking the middle path, which means accepting the reality that your child is in or you're in right now while you're working towards change. Right? So, final, actually, one thing before I get to that. Some key ideas or takeaways that I'm hoping you've gotten from this talk is that regulation is a skill. It's part of a broader self-regulation system, but they are skills that can be taught and strengthened with age, right? Their benefits are far-reaching for working on strong regulation skills, is connected with many long-term benefits like healthy relationships, resilience, and the like. That there are many diverse strategies out there, including emotion identification, building personal toolkits, parent techniques, child techniques, and therapeutic interventions. And that regulation is built through consistent habits, not just during crisis moments. Right? The final exercise I'm going to have you do tonight, and it's a short one, I promise, and I really do appreciate your attention throughout the talk, is what is one idea from today that you want to remember and maybe try tonight or tomorrow, right? Take a moment to just notice it in your mind, write it down, or share it with a loved one as we come off the talk today. We know that writing things down or sharing things is going to improve the likelihood that you're going to try it. So it's a good place to start, right? And I appreciate your time and attention. I believe I did speak a few minutes longer than I was hoping to, but I do hope we have time for a few questions. Thank you so
I'm
much.
the one that
Thank you, Casey.
I'm the one that spoke longer than I was supposed to.
Well, I'm not
We're
sure. I'm not sure.
on the dot.
I'm not
Um,
sure.
Thank you so much. And so we do have a couple of questions that came in.
Cool. Great.
Um, Before we get to some of them, I just thought I love learning. So I liked taking a back seat a little bit today so I could be on the learning side. And I wanted to just share over a couple quick summary items that I saw, just to
God,
help
it's
anyone
so
make some
vibrant.
connections here.
But let's say,
So
let me
for,
just do something.
uh, yeah, okay.
I'm going to
So
work on
for,
muting that while you're talking.
Wait,
oh, okay.
18 minutes.
So on one end, while a lot of these strategies, making things fun, um, tying to senses, and some of it may have felt tailored to kids, it's not. It's not infantilizing. It's actually really based on trying to redirect a core component of your brain to tap more into this rational part of your brain. So when we're talking about touch things in your environment, if you're coming as an adult or thinking about this as an adult, don't think that's just for kids. That same stimulus does the same thing in a kid or as an adult. And so I thought that it's a really important thing. The other thing about making things fun, it's another distraction. So if something is fun to help regulate our emotions, we're more likely to tap into it when we feel like we're in a state of crisis. So again, not infantilizing. Um, and then The last just through point I wanted to share over before passing over some questions to Debbie. Um, the short term, think of our emotional regulation and what we're talking about, the difference between short-term strategies and long-term strategies. Think about it like a spinning top on a table. The short-term strategies is we dysregulate and the top has fallen over. And so those short-term strategies are to get us spinning again. And when we experience a lot of emotional dysregulation, we're very wobbly as a spinning top. The long-term strategies decrease the wobbliness. It makes it so we don't fall over into crisis mode as much. And so the short-term strategies are let's get back to a foundation where I can think rationally. The long term is let's fall over less often where we don't need as much. So